In a single night, 185,000 soldiers were killed. They did not die in battle. There were no swords raised against them, no armies charging through their lines, no siege machines broken, no walls breached. They simply went to sleep as the most powerful military force on the face of the earth, and they woke up dead. Every one of them. 185,000 men who had conquered nations, who had humiliated kings, who had laughed at the God of Israel, gone before the sun rose, and the man who had sent them, the most feared king in the world, packed up what was left of his army and went home in silence. He would never threaten Judah again. He would die at the hands of his own sons, in his own temple, kneeling before a god of wood that could not save him. This is the story of how that happened. This is the story of a king who prayed, a prophet who spoke, and a God who answered in a way that the ancient world had never seen before and would never see again. This is the story of Hezekiah, and it begins long before that night. It begins with an empire built on terror. To understand what happened in Jerusalem in the 8th century before Christ, you have to understand what Assyria was. Because Assyria was not simply a nation with a large army. Assyria was a machine, a system of conquest so efficient, so brutal, and so psychologically devastating that it had reshaped the known world for 2 centuries before Hezekiah was born. The Assyrian Empire rose from the flat plains between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers in what is today northern Iraq. Their capital was Nineveh, a city of enormous wealth and massive walls, a city so large that the book of Jonah tells us it took 3 days to walk across it. From Nineveh, the Assyrian kings extended their reach outward in every direction, and they did so not merely through military force, but through a carefully engineered system of fear. The Assyrians were, by any historical account, among the most violent conquerors the ancient world had ever produced. Their own inscriptions, and they left many, carved proudly into stone, describe in precise detail what they did to the peoples they defeated. They impaled prisoners on stakes outside the walls of conquered cities and left them to die slowly in the sun, visible to anyone approaching from miles away. They skinned leaders alive and stretched their skins on the city gates as trophies of conquest. They cut off the hands and feet of captives in public ceremonies designed to humiliate as much as to punish. They blinded prisoners by the thousands, scooping out their eyes with iron tools. They stacked the severed heads of the slain into pyramids at the entrances of towns as permanent warnings to neighboring peoples considering resistance. They deported entire populations, uprooting peoples from their homelands and resettling them hundreds of miles away so that the bonds of community, language, tradition, and collective memory that might fuel future rebellion were permanently severed. And they wrote all of this down. They boasted of it. They carved it onto the walls of their palaces and the surfaces of stone monuments because the record of atrocity was itself a weapon. The annals of the Assyrian kings read like inventories of horror, written with the pride of men who believed that their capacity for destruction was proof of divine favor. Their gods had made them strong, and their strength proved their gods were real. That was the theology of Assyria. Power was its own justification. Terror was its own argument. And for 2 centuries, no one in the ancient Near East had been able to answer it. This was not random cruelty. It was policy. It was engineered, deliberate, and coldly rational from the perspective of imperial control. The Assyrians understood that if your reputation was terrifying enough, your enemies would sometimes surrender before a single soldier reached their gates. And they were right. Nation after nation fell before them. Not always because of military defeat, but because of the weight of dread that preceded the army's arrival. To see the Assyrian forces marching toward your city with their chariots and their siege engines and their seemingly countless soldiers was to already know in your bones that you had lost. Many kings simply opened their gates. Many simply paid tribute and submitted without fighting, because the alternative was something no one wanted to imagine, and everyone had already heard about. By the time Hezekiah came to the throne of Judah, the Assyrian Empire stretched from the borders of Egypt in the south to the mountains of Urartu in the north, from the coast of the Mediterranean Sea in the west to the plains of Babylon in the east. They were the superpower of their world without any serious rival. No nation had successfully stood against them in living memory. No city had defied them and survived with its people intact. And they were coming closer to Jerusalem with every passing year, like a slow tide that eventually reaches every shore. Hezekiah was the son of a king named Ahaz, and Ahaz was, by every biblical account, a disaster. He had led the people of Judah deep into idolatry. He had burned his own son as an offering to foreign gods in the valley of Ben Hinnom, following the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before Israel. He had filled Jerusalem with pagan altars, closed the doors of the temple of the Lord, and even stripped the temple of its sacred furnishings to send as tribute to the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser. When Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser personally, he saw an altar there that impressed him so much that he sent detailed plans back to Jerusalem so that a replica could be built in the temple courtyard. He dismantled the bronze altar of the Lord to make room for this foreign imitation. Under Ahaz, Judah was not a free nation. It was a small, frightened territory that existed at the pleasure of a foreign power, and its king had traded the worship of the living God for the approval of the king of Assyria. When Ahaz died and his son Hezekiah came to the throne at 25 years old, something changed entirely. The Bible introduces him with one of the highest commendations it ever gives to any king of Judah or Israel. 2 Kings chapter 18 says that Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, and that there was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. He held fast to the Lord and did not stop following him, but kept the commands the Lord had given to Moses. That is an extraordinary statement in its historical context. It places Hezekiah in a category almost entirely his own among the long and complicated succession of kings who had sat on David's throne. Most of them had compromised at some point. Most of them had tolerated the high places, the idol shrines, the foreign altars. Most of them had done some things right and some things badly wrong. Hezekiah was different, and the difference showed immediately. In the very first year of his reign, in the first month, Hezekiah opened the doors of the temple that his father had closed, repaired them, and called the priests and Levites to consecrate themselves and purify the house of the Lord. He stood before them and gave a speech in which he acknowledged the sin of the previous generations with a directness and a lack of defensiveness that was itself remarkable. Their fathers had been unfaithful, had done evil in the eyes of the Lord, had forsaken him, and turned their faces away from his dwelling place, and turned their backs on him. He said it plainly. He did not minimize it. And then he told the priests to make atonement for all Israel, because it was his intention to make a covenant with the Lord God of Israel, so that his fierce anger might turn away from the people. The temple was cleaned, consecrated, and reopened in 16 days. Hezekiah then organized a massive national gathering to celebrate the Passover, a feast that had not been properly observed for generations. He sent messengers throughout Judah and Israel, and even into the territories that Assyria had already resettled with foreign peoples, inviting whoever remained to come to Jerusalem and celebrate the Passover to the Lord. Many laughed at the messengers and mocked them, but many others humbled themselves and came. 2 Chronicles says, "The assembly that gathered was very large, and the celebration that followed was unlike anything Jerusalem had seen since the days of Solomon." Hezekiah also smashed the sacred stones, cut down the Asherah poles, and destroyed the high places and altars throughout Judah. And then he did something that might surprise even the most observant reader. He destroyed the bronze serpent that Moses himself had made in the wilderness. That object went back to the book of Numbers. When the Israelites were traveling through the desert and a plague of venomous snakes came among them as a consequence of their rebellion against God, the Lord told Moses to make a bronze serpent and lift it up on a pole. Anyone who looked at it would live. That object had been preserved for over 700 years. It was ancient, it was associated with a miracle, it carried the name of Moses, and by Hezekiah's time, the people had begun to burn incense to it. They had turned a holy object into an idol. Hezekiah called it Nehushtan, just a piece of bronze, and shattered it. He would not allow even a sacred relic from the greatest era of Israel's history to become a substitute for the living God. That act of decisive, unsentimental faith tells you more about the character of Hezekiah than almost any other single moment in his story. But while Hezekiah was reforming Judah from within, the world outside its borders was not standing still. The Assyrian Empire was moving, and a new king had come to its throne. The king on the Assyrian throne during most of Hezekiah's reign was a man named Sennacherib, son of Sargon II. He was not the first Assyrian king to threaten Israel and Judah. That had been happening for decades, but he was among the most aggressive, most capable, and most personally ambitious of his dynasty. His father, Sargon, had already done something that shook the entire region to its foundations. In 722 BC, Sargon's forces had conquered Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, after a 3-year siege. They deported the population, tens of thousands of Israelites uprooted from their land and resettled in Assyrian territory, scattered among foreign peoples whose languages they did not speak and whose gods they did not recognize. In their place, Sargon brought in peoples from other conquered territories, from Babylon, Cutha, Avva, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, who were resettled in the towns of Samaria. The northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes descended from the sons of Jacob, effectively ceased to exist as a people in their land. Their identity, their culture, their continuity, all of it dissolved into the great machinery of Assyrian resettlement. This was not ancient history by Hezekiah's time. People in Jerusalem remembered it. They had relatives who had lived in the north. Everyone understood what Assyria was capable of when a nation resisted, and everyone understood that Judah was next if Assyria chose to turn south in earnest. For a period after coming to the throne, Hezekiah had continued paying the tribute that his father had established, maintaining the technical status of a vassal, while quietly rebuilding the spiritual and military strength of his kingdom. But something shifted. Whether it was the confidence that came from seeing God's visible blessing on his reforms, or a political calculation about Sennacherib's attention being occupied elsewhere, or simply the conviction of a man of faith that he could not spend his whole reign paying silver to a king who mocked the God of Israel. Hezekiah made a decision that was, by any rational military calculation of the time, an act of political suicide. He rebelled against the king of Assyria. He stopped paying tribute. He refused to serve him. The Bible records this plainly in 2 Kings chapter 18, without extensive commentary, as if the statement itself is sufficient. He rebelled. And he knew, as clearly as any man in his position could know, what Assyria did to people who rebelled. In preparation for what he knew would inevitably follow, Hezekiah fortified Jerusalem with a seriousness and scale that the city had not seen in generations. He repaired every section of the city wall that had fallen into disrepair, built towers on top of it, constructed a second outer wall, and strengthened the terraces of the city. He organized the military forces and appointed commanders, addressing them publicly and telling them to be strong and courageous, and not to be afraid or discouraged by the king of Assyria and the vast army with him. For there was a greater power with Judah than with Assyria. With Assyria was an arm of flesh, but with Judah was the Lord their God, who would help them and fight their battles. He also undertook the most ambitious engineering project of his reign, one that still astonishes visitors today. Jerusalem's greatest strategic vulnerability was its water supply. The primary source of fresh water, the Gihon Spring, was located outside the city walls, which meant that any besieging army could simply cut off access to it and wait the city out. No siege ramp, no battering ram, no arrows required, just patience, and the city would eventually surrender or die of thirst. Hezekiah ordered his workers to dig a tunnel through over 500 meters of solid limestone bedrock, redirecting the flow of the Gihon Spring through the hill and into the city, emptying into a pool called the Pool of Siloam inside the walls. The work was done from both ends simultaneously, two teams of men cutting through solid rock toward each other in the dark, relying on sound to navigate, their axes echoing through the stone until they broke through and heard each other from the other side, and the water came rushing in. An inscription carved into the tunnel wall by the workers themselves was discovered in the 19th century and records that exact moment, the sound of axes, the breakthrough, the flow of water. Hezekiah's tunnel still exists today. Archaeologists have walked through it. Visitors still walk through it. It is 533 meters long, cut through limestone, and it was built under the pressure of a coming war by a king who believed that God would help those who also prepared. Sennacherib did not come immediately. There were years of campaigns elsewhere. He was managing an empire of staggering complexity, moving armies across thousands of miles, suppressing rebellions in Babylon and on the eastern frontiers. But eventually he turned his full attention to the west. And when he came with everything. The Assyrian records from Sennacherib's own royal annals survive today, preserved in clay prisms, now housed in museums in London, Chicago, and Jerusalem. He describes his Western campaign in his characteristic, boastful style, listing every city he approached, every king who submitted in advance, every tribute payment delivered to him at his camp. He marched down through Phoenicia, received the submission of multiple kings who had no appetite for resistance, then moved into Philistine territory before turning toward Judah. 2 Kings tells us that Sennacherib came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. The Assyrian annals make the same claim with numbers: 46 walled cities taken, over 200,000 people deported. Among the most significant of the cities he took was Lachish. Lachish was the second most important city in Judah after Jerusalem itself. A massive, heavily fortified city, sitting in the foothills of the Shephelah that controlled the main road from the coastal plain into the Judean highlands. It was the kind of city that was supposed to be able to hold out against a prolonged siege. The Assyrians built an enormous siege ramp of piled earth and stone against the city walls. That ramp has been excavated by archaeologists and is still partially visible today. And they brought the city down. Sennacherib was so proud of this conquest that he commissioned a frieze for the central throne room of his palace at Nineveh, depicting the entire Battle of Lachish in extraordinary detail across carved stone panels many meters long. The siege ramp being built under heavy arrow fire from the defenders, the battering rams attacking the gates from multiple angles, men hurling firebrands down onto the siege machines from the walls, Assyrian soldiers impaling prisoners on stakes while the population is led away into captivity, and Sennacherib himself enthroned on a hill, watching everything, receiving the spoils. That frieze was excavated in the 19th century and can be seen today in the British Museum in London. It is among the most remarkable pieces of ancient military art ever discovered. It shows you, in carved stone, exactly what the world looked like from Jerusalem's perspective in 701 BC. This was what was coming. With Lachish fallen and his forces systematically taking city after city throughout Judah, Sennacherib sent a message to Hezekiah. Hezekiah's response is recorded in scripture with notable honesty. No attempt to make the king look more heroic than he was. Hezekiah sent messengers to Sennacherib at Lachish with these words: "I have done wrong. Withdraw from me, and I will pay whatever you demand." Sennacherib set his price at 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. To produce that enormous sum, Hezekiah stripped the silver from the doorposts and doorframes of the temple, cut the gold from the temple doors that he himself had overlaid, and emptied the royal treasury of everything it contained. He sent it all, and Sennacherib took every piece, and then he sent his army toward Jerusalem anyway. This moment reveals what Sennacherib actually wanted. It was never only tribute. It was never simply a financial arrangement. He wanted the city. He wanted to destroy the one nation that had dared to rebel, to make a public and permanent example of the one king in the region who had refused to bow. Payment was not enough. Full submission was not enough. He wanted to enter Jerusalem and to do to it what he had done to Lachish, what his father had done to Samaria, what Assyria had done to every people who had stood in its path. And so, even after collecting everything Hezekiah had, he sent a large military force toward the city commanded by one of his senior officials, known by the title of Rabshakeh, meaning something close to chief cupbearer or chief of staff, a high-ranking military and diplomatic official. This man came with an army sufficient to terrify the city and took up position near the conduit of the upper pool on the road to the launderer's field, directly outside the walls. What followed was not an immediate assault. It was a speech. It is one of the most psychologically sophisticated acts of warfare in the entire historical record. The Rabshakeh called for Hezekiah's representatives to come out. 3 senior officials came: Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, who was administrator of the household, Shebna, the secretary of state, and Joah, son of Asaph, the royal recorder. And the Rabshakeh began to speak. He spoke loudly, deliberately in Hebrew, not in Aramaic, the diplomatic language, so that every soldier standing on the walls above could hear and understand every single word. He began by attacking confidence itself, systematically, point by point. On what, he asked, are you basing this confidence of yours? Was Hezekiah trusting Egypt? Egypt was a splintered reed that would pierce the hand of any man who leaned on it. Pharaoh's promises were air. Was he trusting in the Lord? But had not Hezekiah himself removed the high places and altars of the Lord and told the people they must worship only in Jerusalem? He was deliberately twisting the facts. Hezekiah had removed pagan altars, not the true worship of God. But he was twisting them in Hebrew, in front of soldiers, and the distortion was designed to plant confusion and doubt. Then he offered something devastating in its specificity. If Hezekiah could provide 2,000 horsemen, Assyria would give him 2,000 horses. You don't even have enough trained cavalry to fill 2,000 horses. How could you possibly resist the force I have brought against you? And then came his most calculated argument of all. He declared that he had come against Jerusalem with the direct authorization of the Lord God of Israel himself. He said the Lord had told him, "Go up against this land and destroy it." He was appropriating the language of God, claiming divine mandate for Assyrian conquest, telling the soldiers on the walls that their own God had commissioned their enemies to destroy them. It was the most psychologically precise element of the entire speech. Hezekiah's officials heard this and immediately asked him to please speak in Aramaic rather than Hebrew, for the people on the wall could hear. The Rabshakeh refused. He raised his voice even louder and called directly to the men on the wall, "Do not let Hezekiah deceive you. Do not let him persuade you to trust in the Lord. No God of any nation has ever delivered his people from the hand of the king of Assyria. Not one." He listed them: the gods of Hamath, of Arpad, of Sepharvaim, of Samaria. Where are those gods now? Did they save their people, their cities, their kings? Of course not. What makes you think it will be any different for Jerusalem? It was a complete demolition of every possible source of hope. Military power, You cannot fight us. Egypt, they will not save you. God, he has either sent us against you, or he cannot stop us. The message to every soldier on that wall was unmistakable. The choice before you is between surrendering and dying, and one of those options involves much less suffering. The Rabshakeh was not simply asking for surrender. He was trying to produce it by collapsing faith before a sword was ever drawn. Hezekiah's officials came back to the king with their clothes torn, the ancient gesture of grief and horror, and reported everything they had heard. Hezekiah heard it and tore his own clothes, covered himself in sackcloth, and went directly into the house of the Lord. He also sent messengers to the prophet Isaiah, and the message he sent carries the unmistakable texture of a man at the edge of everything he can bear. He described it as a day of distress and rebuke and disgrace, like a woman in labor who has no strength left to push. He asked Isaiah to pray, because maybe the Lord would hear the words with which the Rabshakeh had ridiculed the living God, and would rebuke him for what he had said. Isaiah's response came back quickly, and with a steadiness that was itself remarkable under the circumstances. Do not be afraid, the word said, of what you have heard. Those words with which the underlings of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me, I am going to put a spirit in him, so that when he hears a certain report, he will return to his own country, and there I will have him cut down with the sword. But the pressure did not let up. Sennacherib, now dealing with military developments to the south involving the Egyptian army, sent a letter directly to Hezekiah, not a speech, a written document. Words that could be carried and read again and again, that could be passed from hand to hand, that could not be interrupted or qualified in the moment of their delivery. The letter said, "Do not let the God you depend on deceive you when he says Jerusalem will not be handed over to the king of Assyria. Surely you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the countries, destroying them completely. And will you be delivered? Did the gods of those nations deliver them?" The letter named them one more time: Hamath, Arpad, Sepharvim, Hena, Iva, and ended with the obvious implied conclusion. Those gods did not save those peoples. Your God will not save you. Nothing about this situation is different from every other situation that has ended with Assyrian victory. And Hezekiah took the letter. He went up to the temple of the Lord, and he spread it out before the Lord. He unrolled the document in the sanctuary, laid it physically before God, and prayed. What he prayed is one of the most carefully constructed prayers in the Bible, and it repays close attention. He did not simply weep and cry for help. He prayed with clarity, with theological precision, and with a remarkably clear sense of what was actually at stake, not just for Jerusalem, but before the watching nations. He began by addressing God in his greatness and his uniqueness. Lord Almighty, God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim, you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. He then asked God to listen, to open his eyes and see, to hear all the words that Sennacherib had sent to ridicule the living God. He acknowledged the military reality without flinching. It is true, Lord, that the Assyrian kings have laid waste all these nations and their lands. They have thrown their gods into the fire and destroyed them, for they were not gods, but only wood and stone, fashioned by human hands. That is why they could destroy them. That is the theological pivot of the entire prayer. Hezekiah understood with clarity why those other nations had fallen. Their gods were not real. They were created objects, carved, chiseled, painted, made by the same human hands that were fully capable of breaking them. Of course, the Assyrians could destroy them. You can burn wood and shatter stone. Those gods offered no resistance to Assyrian armies because they had no existence beyond the materials from which they were made. But the God of Israel was not like them. He was not a deity made from the world. He was the God who made the world, who existed before creation and outside of it, who was no more containable in a carved image than fire is containable in paper. And so Hezekiah's petition rested on that foundation. Now, Lord our God, deliver us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you, Lord, are the only God. That final phrase deserves a moment of attention. Hezekiah did not pray only for the survival of Jerusalem, as urgent and real as that need was. He prayed so that the nations would know. He framed the entire crisis not as a local military emergency, but as a question before the watching world about the identity and power of God. If Sennacherib took Jerusalem, the message delivered to every surrounding nation would be exactly what the Rabshakeh had argued, that the God of Israel was simply one more powerless local deity, no different from the gods of Hamath and Arpad, crushed without difficulty under the wheels of Assyrian expansion. Hezekiah was asking God to vindicate his own name in front of the nations, to demonstrate to the watching world what kind of God he actually was. God answered through Isaiah, and the answer was comprehensive and magnificent. The oracle in Isaiah chapter 37 is addressed not to Hezekiah, but directly to Sennacherib. God speaking to the Assyrian king in the second person through the prophet, as if dictating a letter in response to the one Sennacherib had sent. It opens, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The virgin daughter of Zion despises and mocks you. The daughter of Jerusalem tosses her head as you flee." Then God asked the central question, "Who is it you have ridiculed and blasphemed? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes in pride? Against the Holy One of Israel." God then did something extraordinary. He reframed the entire history of Assyrian conquest. Sennacherib had boasted of his own power, how he had dried up the rivers of Egypt, cut down the tallest forests of Lebanon, brought low the fortified cities, conquered nation after nation by the irresistible force of his armies. God answered him, "Have you not heard? Long ago I ordained it. In days of old I planned it. Now I have brought it to pass. Everything you have done, every nation you conquered, every city you brought down, every people you scattered, none of it happened because of your strength. You were my instrument. I allowed those nations to fall. I planned it before you were born. You did not achieve those conquests by your own power. I permitted them for purposes of my own that you cannot comprehend. Everything Sennacherib had built his identity and his empire on, his invincibility, his divine mandate, his special relationship with the gods, God dismantled by claiming sovereign ownership over every victory Sennacherib had ever celebrated as his own. And then the pivot arrived, and it was absolute. But I know where you stay, and when you come and go, and how you rage against me. Because you rage against me, and because your insolence has reached my ears, I will put my hook in your nose and my bit in your mouth, and I will make you return by the way you came. The imagery was precise and deliberate. The Assyrians used hooks in the noses and bits in the mouths of the captives they paraded in their victory processions. God was saying to Sennacherib, "I will do to you what you have done to others. You will be led where I choose, not where you intend." God then gave Hezekiah a sign about the restoration of the land. The people would eat what grew by itself, then what sprang from the ground, and in the third year they would plant and harvest and live in normal time again. A remnant would take root and bear fruit. The zeal of the Lord Almighty would accomplish it. And then the specific military promise, stated with the precision of a sworn oath. The king of Assyria will not enter this city or shoot an arrow here. He will not come before it with a shield or build a siege ramp against it. By the way that he came, he will return. He will not enter this city, declares the Lord. I will defend this city and save it, for my sake and for the sake of my servant David. Then the text delivers what came next, in words that are among the most quietly devastating sentences in all of the Old Testament. They are stripped of drama, stripped of description, stripped of everything except the essential fact. That night, the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. When the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. No description of what the angel looked like. No account of fire descending from the sky or storm sweeping through the camp. No screaming heard from inside the city walls. No narrative of soldiers falling one after another through the hours of the night. Just, the angel of the Lord went out. And in the morning, there were all the dead bodies. 185,000 men, the most powerful army in the known world. Dead before sunrise, in the dark, without a battle. Historians have offered various theories about what the mechanism of death might have been. Herodotus, the Greek historian writing a generation or so after the event, records a tradition about an Assyrian army that was forced to withdraw from Egypt after field mice ate through their bowstrings and quivers. Some scholars believe this is a distant and garbled reflection of the same withdrawal, possibly pointing to a plague that spread through the camp with catastrophic speed. Ancient armies, with their crowded conditions and minimal sanitation and close quarters, were historically vulnerable to devastating outbreaks of infectious disease. Others have pointed to bubonic plague or a similarly fast-moving epidemic. But the biblical text itself gives no natural explanation and shows no interest in providing one. The angel went out. The men died. The city stood. Those are the facts the text considers essential. The God who made the world does not need to explain to that world how he acts within it. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, broke camp and withdrew. He returned to Nineveh and stayed there. That word "stayed" carries everything. This was a king who had never stayed anywhere he had not already reduced to submission. He was defined by advance, by momentum, by the endless accumulation of new conquests and new humiliations of new enemies. Now he went home and stayed. He made no further campaign against Judah. He never again threatened Jerusalem. The Bible records nothing more about him in relation to Hezekiah or Judah. He stayed in Nineveh, and the silence on the other side of that morning was total. But Sennacherib's story was not finished. Years later, perhaps nearly 2 decades later, based on the Assyrian Chronicles, Sennacherib was in his palace in Nineveh, in the temple of his god Nisroch. He was worshipping. He was kneeling before the carved image of the deity whose authority he believed had underwritten everything he had ever done. Every nation crushed, every rebellion suppressed, every blasphemy against other people's gods committed with impunity. And while he knelt there in his own temple, his sons Adramelech and Sharezer came in and killed him with the sword. They then fled to the land of Ararat, far to the north. And another son, Esarhaddon, succeeded him on the throne. The Assyrian royal chronicles confirm the assassination. They cannot explain it adequately, cannot present it as anything other than a violent rupture within the royal family, but they confirm it. The king who had sent letters saying that no god had ever saved anyone from Assyrian power, who had said the Lord was no different from the gods of Hamath and Arpad, who had brought 185,000 soldiers to the walls of Jerusalem. That king was killed by his own sons, in his own house, kneeling before his own God, in the city to which he had returned in failure. It is difficult to overstate the theological weight of that ending when it is set against everything that came before it. God had made specific promises through Isaiah. Sennacherib would not shoot an arrow into Jerusalem. He would not come before it with a shield. He would not build a siege ramp against it. He would return by the way he came. Every element of that oracle was fulfilled with exact precision. No arrows entered the city. No Assyrian shield was raised against its walls. No siege ramp was constructed. Sennacherib withdrew by the same road he had come on. And the man who had been the world's most powerful argument against the existence of a god worth trusting died violently, in worship of a god that could not protect even its own devotee, in the city from which he had retreated, after failing to accomplish the one thing he had come to do. Now, we must stay with Hezekiah. because his story does not end with Sennacherib's withdrawal. There is another chapter, more intimate, and in some ways more searching, and it belongs to the full telling of this life. Around this same period, the biblical text places it in close connection with the Assyrian crisis. Though the exact sequence is debated among scholars, Hezekiah became gravely ill. The prophet Isaiah came to him with words that no one would choose to receive from a man of God. This is what the Lord says, "Put your house in order, because you are going to die. You will not recover from this illness." Hezekiah was not old. He was a king in the middle of his life and his reign, with enemies pressing in from every side, and a nation that had come to depend on the direction and faith he provided. And the prophet stood before him and said plainly that he was going to die. What Hezekiah did next is described with great and quiet tenderness in the text. He turned his face to the wall and prayed to the Lord. He said, "Remember, Lord, how I have walked before you faithfully and with wholehearted devotion, and have done what is good in your eyes." And Hezekiah wept bitterly. He wept. This man who had stood firm against the most powerful empire on earth, who had torn down idols and reopened the temple and organized a national Passover and engineered tunnels through solid limestone. He turned away from everyone who might see him, turned his face to the wall, and he cried. There is nothing ceremonial or performed about it. It is simply a man who did not want to die, telling God so in the most honest terms available to him. Before Isaiah had even left the middle court of the palace complex on his way out, the word of the Lord came to him again, and he was told to go back. He went back with this. "This is what the Lord, the God of your father David says. I have heard your prayer and seen your tears. I will heal you. On the third day from now, you will go up to the temple of the Lord. I will add 15 years to your life, and I will deliver you and this city from the hand of the king of Assyria. I will defend this city for my sake and for the sake of my servant David." God heard the tears. The text says so specifically, and the specificity is remarkable. It did not say God heard his prayer, though the prayer was clearly answered. It said God saw his tears. The weeping of a man who did not want to die, prayed privately with his face to the wall, away from his officials and his advisors and everyone who depended on him to be strong. Those tears were seen. They were noticed. They were answered. Isaiah then prescribed a poultice of pressed figs to be placed on the infected wound, and Hezekiah recovered. And as a sign confirming the promise, the shadow on the sundial of Ahaz moved backward 10 steps. The sun appeared to reverse its path in the sky, a sign observed not only in Jerusalem, but by peoples beyond its borders. Envoys came later from Babylon specifically to inquire about what had been seen in the heavens and to speak with the king who had recovered from a fatal illness. Those Babylonian envoys arrived with letters and gifts, and Hezekiah received them warmly, perhaps too warmly, as a man who has survived a death sentence might be inclined to celebrate life without sufficient caution. He showed them everything. He showed them his treasury, the silver, the gold, the spices, the fine oil. He showed them his armory. He opened every storeroom and every part of his palace to them. There was nothing in his kingdom he did not show them. There is something deeply human about this moment. Hezekiah had just come through a period of extraordinary faith and extraordinary deliverance. He had faced an empire, prayed through an illness, seen an army destroyed overnight, received 15 more years of life. And in the aftermath of all of that, surrounded by envoys who had traveled a great distance to see him, he opened every door. Perhaps it was gratitude and the desire to share his abundance. Perhaps it was pride, the very natural human tendency to want to be seen as significant by people who represent a powerful and sophisticated civilization. Perhaps it was simply the relief of a man who had spent years under siege, now able to show that he was more than the frightened king paying silver to stay alive. Whatever it was too much. Isaiah came afterward and asked directly where these men had come from and what they had seen. When Hezekiah told him they had seen everything, Isaiah delivered a prophecy of grief. "The time will come," he said, "when everything you have shown them, all the treasures of your palace, will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, and some of your own descendants, your own flesh and blood, will become servants in the palace of the king of Babylon." Hezekiah received this prophecy with a response that is honest in a way that makes some readers uncomfortable. "The word of the Lord you have spoken is good," he said. And then, "Will there not be peace and security in my lifetime?" He accepted the coming disaster, but found something like relief in knowing it would fall on a generation he would not live to see. The text records his answer without condemnation. It is the response of a human being, tired and tested and finite, and the Bible leaves it there for us to sit with. Those 15 additional years of life that God granted produced a son named Manasseh, born during those years, who would one day succeed his father on the throne of Judah. Manasseh would reign for 55 years, the longest reign in the history of Judah's kings, and he would spend much of that reign systematically dismantling everything his father had built. He rebuilt the high places Hezekiah had demolished. He re-erected the altars to Baal. He worshipped the sun and moon and stars. He practiced sorcery and consulted mediums. He placed an idol in the temple of the Lord. 2 Kings says that Manasseh led Judah and Jerusalem to do more evil than the nations the Lord had destroyed before Israel entered the land. The son born from the extra years God granted to Hezekiah became, in ways that defy easy resolution, a major instrument in setting in motion the eventual fall of Jerusalem. History does not unfold simply. Grace extended to one generation can produce consequences felt across several more. The text does not explain this. It simply records it. But none of that diminishes what Hezekiah was or what he did. He died after a reign of 29 years, and he was buried in the most honored section of the royal tombs, and all Judah and the people of Jerusalem honored him at his death. The Assyrian record itself, as hostile and self-serving a document as one can imagine, confirms that Jerusalem was not taken. Sennacherib's annals describe Hezekiah being shut up like a bird in a cage. They describe tribute delivered. They describe cities captured. They do not describe entering Jerusalem. That absence from his own boastful record is one of the most significant silences in all of ancient Near Eastern history. Sennacherib recorded every conquest. He did not record taking Jerusalem, because he did not take it. The story of Hezekiah and Sennacherib is the story of what happens when a human being reaches the complete end of what human beings can do, and decides that this is not the same as the end of what God can do. Sennacherib was not a metaphor or a story. He was flesh and iron, and 185,000 soldiers. He was the most powerful military force the world had ever seen. He had done exactly what he said he had done to every nation and every city that had defied him. He had every reason to expect that Jerusalem would be no different. The tribute had been paid. The cities had fallen. The speech had been delivered. The letter had arrived. By every visible and rational measure, the outcome was already determined. And one man went to the temple and spread the letter before God and prayed. And the God of Israel answered. There is also a word here for anyone who has ever received what felt like a death sentence, whether from a doctor, from a failing relationship, from a career that collapsed, from a diagnosis that arrived in words as flat and final as the ones Isaiah delivered to Hezekiah. Put your house in order, because you are going to die. What Hezekiah did in that moment was not heroic in the conventional sense. He did not gather himself and issue a bold declaration of faith. He turned to the wall and wept. He told God exactly what he felt, which was that he did not want this, that he had tried to live faithfully, that he was asking for something different. And God, who had made the world and held it together and directed the armies of the greatest empire in the ancient Near East according to his own purposes, that God heard a man crying alone in a room and changed his mind, or rather, revealed a mercy that had always been available to anyone willing to ask. That is the testimony at the center of this story. Not that faith makes hard things easy. Hezekiah wept when he was told he was going to die. He stripped the temple treasury to pay tribute that was not enough. He made a strategic mistake with the Babylonian envoys that carried consequences he would never live to see. He was a man, and he experienced everything that human beings experience: fear, grief, miscalculation, the weight of what was coming. But through all of it, there was a consistent direction to his life. When the letter came, he went to the temple. When the death sentence came, he turned to the wall and prayed. When the army was outside the gates, he sent to the prophet. The pattern was not perfection. It was orientation. A life turned consistently toward God, even when everything visible suggested that God was insufficient for the problem at hand. The contrast between Hezekiah and Sennacherib is not ultimately a contrast between a weak man and a strong one. It is a contrast between two different answers to the same question. Where does real power come from? Sennacherib's answer was written in stone on the walls of his palace. It comes from armies, from iron, from the accumulated force of conquered nations, from gods who reward the violent and the successful. Hezekiah's answer was written in a different way. In a tunnel dug through limestone, in a temple door opened after years of being shut, in a letter spread on the floor of a sanctuary, in a man weeping with his face to a wall. Power comes from the God who made the world, and that God can do in a night what no army accumulates in a generation. The God who answered on that night outside Jerusalem is the same God who made the promise to David, the same God who spoke to Abraham in the dark, the same God who would one day send into the world not an angel to kill an army, but a son to absorb the world's violence into himself and come out the other side alive. The deliverance of Jerusalem in 701 BC was extraordinary and real, and it still echoes, but it was a signpost towards something even greater still. Hezekiah prayed that all the kingdoms of the earth would know that the Lord alone was God. The answer began that night, with the morning light revealing the dead bodies of 185,000 soldiers. That answer continues to unfold across every century since. What Sennacherib could not understand, and what the Rabshakeh's speech revealed so clearly, was that the God of Israel was not a God among gods, a regional deity to be weighed against other regional deities, a divine patron who might or might not be strong enough to protect his territory when faced with a sufficiently powerful human army. The God of Israel was the God who made the world in which Assyria existed, in which Sennacherib's armies marched, in which the Rabshakeh's carefully crafted speech was spoken. He was not a piece on the board. He was the one who made the board, and the pieces, and the players, and the game itself. To mock him was not to score a point in a contest of power. It was to mistake the nature of the reality one was standing in entirely. Sennacherib made that mistake, and one morning in 701 BC, he began to understand the cost of it, as his officers walked through a camp of 185,000 dead men and tried to comprehend what had happened in the night. Jerusalem did not fall to Sennacherib. It would fall eventually, to Babylon, to empires yet to rise. But not yet. Not in 701 BC. Not to the man who sent a letter mocking the living God and expected no reply, because a king went to his temple and spread that letter before God and asked him to act. And God acted. And in the morning there were all the dead bodies, and the city stood.